I have experienced where staff see you as a short-term annoyance, and that's something that you have to break through. Obviously, the goal is to help develop their department. Now, obviously, there could be some staff members that are the issue. That, unfortunately, as a manager, that can be a downfall for your career, is not dealing with your staff. And there's other HR reasons and what have you. But I would say, as an interim coming in, sit down with the staff, find out what their issues are. They have to see you as somebody that's on their side.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Warren Nist, CSSD consultant at Evolved Sterile Processing Consulting, LLC. Warren has a central service career spanning 38 years, with 31 of those years coming in a management position. In his profession, he has worked in progressive metropolitan, university, and community hospital settings, as well as ambulatory surgical and specialty care centers. He's participated in construction project designs of multiple CS departments, ambulatory care sites, as well as other clinical sites, supporting the reprocessing of instrumentation and medical supplies. He's results-oriented with strengths in interpersonal communication, team building, organization, and presentation skills. And Hank, there's a bunch of things at the very end of Warren's bio that are so critical, and some of them are soft skills in a lot of ways. Interpersonal communication, team building, presentation skills. You can apply hard skills to that, but there is a lot to do with just your interest, your passion, and your ability. And that's going to play right into the conversation today about what makes a good interim SPD leader. So I've known Warren for a while. We'll probably talk about that a little bit during the show, but very early in my career, he was a mentor, and it's so great to have him on the show.
I'll tell you, Justin, interim leadership in sterile processing is no joke. You don't get called to be an interim leader if everything's going great. And when there are challenges in sterile processing and they're big enough where you call someone from the outside and you pay a premium to have that person come on site, that means you've got your work cut out for you. And Warren has been doing this for a number of years, and he's got some tremendous insight on what actually works, not only from the facility level, but what works from the interim themselves. What kind of person do you need to be successful in that role? And so that's one of the big reasons that we invited him on this episode in particular.
All right. Well, we're going to get right into it after a short break with Warren Nist, CSSD consultant at Evolved Sterile Processing Consulting, LLC.
You're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Warren Nist, CSSD consultant with Evolved Sterile Processing Consulting, LLC, and Isham Foundation board member. And Warren, you and I actually have known each other since my very earliest days of working around sterile processing, having left nursing and switched over to a vendor role. And so I have a front seat view over your career as to your expertise. And I learned a lot from you. Believe it or not, it's been over 11 years since we met. But I'm really excited. This is your first appearance on the show. I actually kind of feel bad that you haven't been on before. So, better late than never, but welcome.
I appreciate that. Thanks for inviting me. And yeah, 11 years and it went fast. I remember you actually walking into my office pretty much unannounced. And, we quickly developed a good relationship and had great service from the company that you were supporting at the time.
Yeah, I remember we dove into the tracking system pretty deep. That was an enjoyable project and not one that many people like to dive into. So we did. We had fun together. And I also saw renovations of your department. So you have a lot of experience with a lot of different things. And we're going to be talking to you today about how you have brought that experience into interim and consulting roles and really guiding the audience that as they build their careers, that they can kind of take some of these pointers forward, I think. And there's never an abundance of experience in this industry. I always feel like we all need to help each other and lend knowledge. So thanks for doing that today as well.
Sure, absolutely. That's one of the goals I have with my business is really just trying to provide information that is sort of out of the ordinary, if I can find that, to help people develop their repertoire in sterile processing. But on another note, too, if Hank remembers, and this is just a couple years ago, I came out with a logo, and Hank actually helped enhance my logo. So part of your team is part of my team, because that's where the logo comes from.
I actually remember that now, those early days. I think we may have been kicking off our consulting businesses around the same time. And I remember you reaching out. But that's a great point, too, that we'll talk about later on in this interview of it's a small world once you get out of the hospital setting. I think it's easy to think like when you're a manager or when you're a director and there's hundreds of other managers around the country that it's big. You can burn some bridges. You can have beefs with people. But once you get out into the consulting side and into the interim side, that world shrinks rapidly. And you can't afford not to be a team player and to support each other, even if you didn't want to, right? Like I wanted to, obviously, but there are folks out there, if you want to survive and build your business, you have to build those relationships or it's never going to happen.
That's very true. In consulting and even interim management, my last, I'll call it real job in the sense of having a permanent position with a hospital, I was actually hired by an interim AVP for surgical services. And I've developed that, and we kind of maintain that relationship to a small degree. But I have had other interim OR management members who have referred me to folks through sites like LinkedIn and what have you, where people bring me questions, where I just, again, try to help people grow within the industry.
So why don't you tell us why interim leaders exist? Who are they and why do they get called and what do they do when they come on site?
Well, I would say pretty much as in any management role. I mean, management and leaders generally have a lifespan of around 5 years or so. And just like in sterile processing, management is always in flux. There's always a number of open positions throughout the country. It's a difficult role. There's a lot of logistics involved. There's a lot of legalities involved. And unfortunately, as you guys know, there's really no development process for developing managers for sterile processing. You can't go out and get a college degree in sterile processing. So you kind of learn your ropes being in the hot seat a lot of the times. And unfortunately, people move around a lot and fall victim to this process. And not to mean that they don't stay within sterile processing, but sometimes it takes a few different jobs before you get your feet underneath of you. And it just creates a lot of openings. So that being said, there is a lot of opportunity for interim managers, especially for folks like me who've been in the field for decades and are kind of getting to the twilight of our career, but have that ability to come into an established business and make a difference quickly versus trying to find somebody who might, only be in the business for a few years and might be working their way up through the ranks and just not ready for that.
So Warren, walk us through what a common reason or common reasons are that an interim would be called in, right? So like you described, there's a lot of openings, leaders move around, there's reasons that may happen. But, go through some of those reasons and then spend a little time describing what that experience is. Like, how long are these interims usually there? Is there a negotiation process? Kind of walk us through those things.
It really does vary. Let me say that first, depending on, who you're working for. I mean, there's a number of third parties that are willing to bring in folks as interim managers. And the dynamics of those businesses are different from place to place. There are organizations, for example, that have their own interim process, and instead of going out and hiring third parties, so they have a pool of people. But for reasons, the Joint Commission or CMS visits, I would say, ranks pretty high to the top of the list, as well as quality issues within the department. Productivity can be an issue, but I think it's more along the lines of quality issues with trays. Again, the legalities within the business, the guidelines that we must follow. And that varies from state to state as well.
So I'm assuming that the timeline varies also, but I know folks are probably familiar with the traditional traveler position at the technician level, and all those come in around 13 weeks is kind of the standard contract. Does that match up with interim, or are they looking at a different timeline?
The timelines that I'm experiencing on average for interim positions generally fall in the 6 month range. I have seen a few and been contacted by a few people who are even looking for as far out as a year. But yeah, it's a little different than your traveler tech, who, as you noted, usually is around 13 weeks. As a consultant, it certainly can vary. I would say most of the time when I'm contacted, it's somewhere around the 3 month range. But in my case, it's always seems to expand well beyond 3 months.
Now, you mentioned consultant and interim leader. I know there is some overlap there, but they're not necessarily the same thing exactly. So can you differentiate between the two and maybe what some similarities, what some differences are? And then in that, can you describe a profile of a high-performing interim leader? In your opinion, what makes a great interim leader in these scenarios, again, where Joint Commission, where there's quality issues, are really stepping in to some challenging situations? So what are these leaders made of when they're the best of the best?
Well, I would say to differentiate between the interim leadership and consultants is interim leaders generally come in and are designed to be put in place to run the department as any other manager would. So you have anything from staffing to daily production, all the caveats that you have with any other daily management position in sterile processing. There may be particular reasons that you need to deal with, but you're still managing that department as you would if you were a full-time employee. Consultants, again, in my experience, you are generally brought in for one or more particular reasons. In some cases, they may be launching an instrument tracking system, or they may have had a CMS visit and there is a particular facet that needs to be corrected. And that's generally why you might find that timeline be a little bit less in the consulting field than you would be in an interim management, because it takes a little bit more time to find those managers, hire those managers, and then you may even, as that interim manager, be there to support that person onboarding for a period of months as well.
Do you ever transition between the two, Warren? Where you start out as the interim manager, but because the responsibilities are so much focused on the day-to-day and getting things set up, that once they do find that permanent manager, you then stay on in more of a consulting role to do maybe some bigger projects at that point?
I've actually found it to be the reverse, to be honest with you, to come in as a consultant and then to start to blend in more as a interim manager as well. Whether you're helping the manager who's there to grow and develop their skills, because you can certainly do that as a consultant and not step on anybody's toes. But as a interim manager, I haven't really had that happen again with my opportunities where I've blended back into more of a consultant role. It has really been the other way around.
So you talk about blending in. I can imagine that that's part of the challenge, especially when you first arrive. But what are some of the other bigger challenges, the hurdles that you have to get over? And maybe does it take a certain personality type to be able to get over that? Or is it something that is more skill-based?
Well, I think it's both, to be honest with you. First, you need to be flexible. You really need to be flexible because, again, it really does depend on each individual project, but things change very, very quickly from what you were told you needed to be there for him and what you actually find out when you get there. So flexibility is first and foremost. But as far as Hank was asking, what does that individual look like? You obviously need to be current with what the trends are in the field, what the current standards are as well. You need to kind of have that bag of tools. As I said, you need to be flexible. You need to be able to really hit the ground running because time's not on your side. No matter whether you're coming in as an interim or you're coming in as a consultant, you're pressed, and you stay pressed, generally speaking, for the amount of time that you're there. This is not something that you would normally see as a manager developing a sterile processing department, which can take 3 to 5 years, depending on what sterile processing department you're working with. You're pressed for 3 to 6 months to accomplish those goals and then move on. But leave that company in a good place, and that those individuals that are left there can actually take that ball and then run with it and complete whatever else is left over, or at least sustain it is the goal.
So you said pressed during that time frame. And when I hear that, I also think expectations, right? Because you said there are goals, it's laid right out. And the other thing is you got brought in by leadership. And so you also just said something about once you get into the department, you realize that maybe things aren't exactly what's going on doesn't match up with why you were brought in. So that puts you in an uncomfortable position, I would think. There's expectations from the leadership that brought you in that this is the issue. And also, I can imagine sometimes when you've been brought in, maybe there's mutual accountability for the issue, but it was kind of it was presented as one-sided. And so as you begin to see that, you have to navigate that scenario delicately. And how do you communicate that back to the leadership, those findings, without kind of stepping in the problem that was already there that wound up leading you to come?
Well, I will say this. There is a benefit of being an outsider. And this is something that I've actually learned playing these roles compared to being a manager for many years in the past. Leadership does tend to listen to the outsider more, which I have found to be a true benefit. There are certainly tools that you can use, sterile processing assessment reports, for example, to allow you to delve into the difficulties of the department without calling people out and develop the goals further. But it kind of comes back to the proposal. If you're a consultant, for example, what did they propose? You have to be very clear on what the goals are, what the timeline is, and how are you going to achieve them? So, and first and foremost is be honest with you. You have to be honest with them. If you're not honest with them and you produce in their mind an expectation that you cannot accomplish, you've already started in a really bad spot. I'm going to be honest with you. You're kind of behind the 8 ball.
And you're going to be trying to dig out. Yeah, you're trying to dig out of purgatory at that point. So you also talked about some projects. You said one of the things that you might be engaged to do would be to help implement a tracking system, or maybe it's actually to utilize it to its fullest. They already got it, but nobody really knew what to do with it and get it to where it needed to go. But those big projects, especially in an interim management role, I understand how as a consultant you might come in and do a lot of those bigger projects, but as an interim manager, do most interim managers look at those big projects and see it like as their job to tackle those, especially if it wasn't part of the reason that they were brought in, but it's a glaring need that they know will improve the department significantly? Do interim managers see it as their job to tackle that? Is it a bad idea to start projects like that if you might not finish them, or do you just kind of leave it up to the senior leadership that brought you in to help make those decisions?
Well, I think that is part of your weekly updates with those senior leaders that you're working with, is to outline what are the greatest areas of benefit for them. because you said that might not be the reason that you're there, but there may be a greater benefit to accomplish that goal versus other goals. And again, it's an honest timeline. So you do have to speak with those leaders, develop what that plan of action is going to be for that time period that you're going to be there, or as in some cases for me, where we've then extended those timelines to include those extra features so that they're in the spot that they want to be in when you do leave.
All right, Warren. So we've got two groups of people listening to this episode, and I want you to give us some insight for both of those groups. One group is going to be the interims out there themselves, these folks who are already out in the field, already confronting challenges. But one of the biggest challenges that we haven't talked about yet is how to deal with the staff. It is a group of folks that do not have a leader for whatever reason, and sometimes those reasons are not good reasons that their leader's no longer there. So this interim manager has to deal with those folks. I want to get your insight on that piece. At the same time, though, I want to get your insight from the staff's perspective on how these folks at the technician level can best deal with people like you who come up into their department like they own the place. I'm just kidding. But, they come up from the outside, and you said it, it's just true, and it's a little bit cliche, but everybody in the industry knows that administrators like to listen to consultants, even though we can be saying the same thing for 5 or 10 years and they don't listen to us. But then somebody comes in a suit and a tie and they start listening to them. And that can create some contention and some animosity. So I'm wondering if you can share from both sides of that coin the best way to approach that from the staff.
Well, I will say I agree with you, because I have experience where staff see you as a short-term annoyance. And that's something that you have to break through. Obviously, the goal is to help develop their department. Now, obviously, there could be some staff members that are the issue. Unfortunately, as a manager, that can be a downfall for your career, is not dealing with your staff. And there's other HR reasons and what have you. But I would say, as an interim coming in, sit down with the staff, find out what their issues are. They have to see you as somebody that's on their side. Now, you're going to hear stories, even as you develop your risk assessments, and you will, again, hear stories from staff members that said, we asked for that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 1 year ago. You have to let them know that you're there to try to achieve the goals for the department that are going to enhance their workplace. And again, you still have that 80-20 rule where you spend 80% of your time with the staff who you should be spending 20% of the time with. But, it is what it is. Again, I would just recommend working closely with the staff, getting to know the staff. Just like I said before, being honest with them as well, and work your way through it. Every group of people is different. So it just takes time. And as I said earlier, time's not on your side. So I would start day one. Yeah. And
I'm assuming the inverse is true then. If you've got frontline staff who now have this outsider coming into your department, the same is true for those folks, that it's in your best interest as a technician, if you want this experience to be a positive experience that actually improves your team and your processes and gets you resources that you've been asking for, to work with that interim and not against them. Would you agree?
I would agree. I've also seen situations where interims can carry a very big stick, to be honest with you. And you can see staff members leave not on their accord very quickly if they're not participating in working well with the interim manager. When you look at senior leadership, interim management consultants cost. They're not cheap. They're there for a reason, to complete a goal, accomplish something. The expectation is for the staff to work with them. As I said, you have an assessment that is either completed during or after the event, and often you might have staff that are called out in those assessments, needing leadership training or needing other attributes. And then it's up to that senior leadership team to decide, do they want to work with those individuals or do they want to replace those individuals? So it does behoove them to work with the interim managers. It's just not always the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. And I guess it's understandable, again, if you've got staff members who have been there for 5, 10, sometimes 20, 30 years, and they feel like this is my home and I've got a stranger coming into my home who's wanting to change things. But if those things that are being changed are causing patient safety issues and events, to your point, then there is no question that things need to change. And it just so happens that it's this interim and not another interim or another manager who's making the change. And so it's not about the person at that point. It's about the process. And to your point, it's in everyone's best interest, not only the technicians themselves, but it's in the patient's best interest to get with the program, improve the process, and work together as a team. Anytime that you initially say, no, I'm not going to work with that person, no matter who they are, you've already missed the point of sterile processing, which is that collaborative mindset. On a lighter note, though, I do think we're going to have folks listen to the show or maybe even tune in because of the title of the show has something to do with interim management. And they're thinking, okay, I want to do that. I've known people who have done that. I've seen those job postings. I want to travel, but I want to travel in a leadership capacity. And I want to make these big changes that I perhaps haven't been able to make at my own facility because of constrained resources or lack of administrative support. But I want to go do good in the world. How do these people start? Like, how should they be preparing themselves? What's that first step to get into the interim pipeline? Where do you begin?
Well, I mean, if you're getting into the interim pipeline, the pipeline itself is only constrained by your experience. I will say it that way. There are a number of consulting companies that provide interim managers, and each one of them has a different job description of who they will support in interim roles. I mean, there are some out there right now that require you to have a degree. Not all of them do. In fact, I would say most of them don't. They're looking for experience in the field. So, I mean, it's not difficult to get into the pipeline, but to develop yourself for the experience is a whole different process. I would say first, when you're getting involved with a possible site visit, you need to prepare yourself for that site visit ahead of time. You need to know, why are you actually being selected for this project? Second, I would recommend that they go online and research the company that they're going to be working with to learn what is the company's profile, where do they stand, what's their mission, vision, etc. And then again, look at the locale that you're going to be working in, what state that might be. For example, if you're going to New Jersey, and I think most people in management may or may not know this, but New Jersey requires, it's a state statute, that you follow the AMI guidelines. You cross the river in Pennsylvania, it's completely different. So it's not difficult to go online and find the state requirements for sterile processing. So that would be something else that I would do. And working with that company, that whoever you're working with, who is going to provide you as the manager, that third party, again, get as much information as you can from them. They're usually working direct with the senior leadership, and they have the insight of what the difficulties are. Start to build your tools ahead of time. Don't show up day one and then say, okay, now I've got to write policies, or whatever that is. Start to build those tools before you arrive on site, so that you are prepared day one to start moving that department forward.
One follow-up on that. I'm assuming that you had a whole bunch of policies that you've developed over the years, and resources and processes, et cetera, that you've been building sort of your own resource guide for yourself. Things that worked in certain scenarios that are handcrafted by you, by your experience. So I'm sure you're going to say yes to that. So I'm not actually going to have you answer that question. I'm going to have you answer the question of, do you recommend that people begin to do that and start to take policies that they've done and build their own bank so that they can be more effective? Because you could show up at a facility and their policies are completely watered down or way off the mark, right? And that would be a reason why you'd be there. So do you think that's a good idea, or they run into trouble pulling policies from facilities that they've worked at when they're developing that toolbox, so to speak?
Well, yeah, I think building a baseline would be optimum. Knowing your guidelines to help keep them up to date is more important. I will answer your first question, which is yes, I do. But I could build a museum with a lot of it as well, because a lot of it is outdated at this point in time. When you've been in the field, as I have, this is my 38th year, I believe it or not, I have information from the 1990s that I've collected over the years in every position that I've been in. You always have a tidbit that you take along with you. Policies certainly are a benefit to have, and you often do run into situations where policies need to be enhanced. But there's a lot of other tools that you can bring along with you as well. Some that you even build, productivity metrics, design tools, throughput, what have you. There's so much that literally could be probably a podcast on its own as to developing sterile processing tools. So I would say certainly take the good ones, leave the bad ones, develop that toolkit that you'll use for your career.
Well, Warren, it took us too long to have you on the show, but you've already teased your next interview topic. So it probably won't take us so long to have you back. I love that idea. How do you build your own toolbox? And I can definitely see where you're saying the policies are much more guideline driven. So, why try to keep crafting that when you've got a template? But then the productivity metrics and some of the processes around that, that's really great insight, Warren. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Well, I appreciate you having me. Thanks again.
That was Warren Nist, CSSD consultant with Evolve Sterile Processing Consulting, LLC, and he continues to serve as an Isham Foundation board member as well. And Hank, you heard me say at the beginning, I've known Warren for quite a while. He's very capable, very even-keeled as well. I think that's been part of his secret sauce for why he's been such an effective manager. And now, in that interim SPD leader role and consulting role as well. And at the very end, he said something that I think was really critical for anybody out there who is thinking about becoming an interim leader, or maybe it's your first assignment or two. Make sure you come prepared. Do the legwork ahead of time. Learn about what's going on as much as you can from the company that is sending you on assignment. Learn as much as you can, prepare as much as you can, and hit the ground running day one, because the clock starts when you walk in the door.
And Justin, that's the whole point and value of a network, because as hard as you try and as much as you work to develop that toolkit, if you're not sourcing insight and perspective and best practices from other folks in the industry who've been around as long as Warren has, for instance, and you're really missing a lot of value there, because one person can read the guidelines, they can look at policies, they can create tools, but they're only going to be as good as your limited experience, whatever that is. Now, if you network and if you build relationships with other folks in the field, other consultants, other interim managers, and say, hey, what's working for you? What have you used that's been successful in terms of measuring productivity, for instance? That's where the real magic happens. And honestly, I think that's where those toolboxes really get valuable, because you've got external insight and perspective coming in that then all of your tools get that much stronger. I think, honestly, that's my biggest takeaway from this interview tonight.
Well, it was going to lead us into a part two in a future season for sure, is how do you build that toolkit, and not just as an interim leader or as a consultant, but as a manager, as a supervisor. What are the things that you can get involved in today to start building that out and preparing for a long career in the industry? So, Warren, thanks for being an inspiration with those 38 years and 31 years in management. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Podcasts, your favorite podcast application, or download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send that email to us, info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.